Now, over the last few years, we've covered some of the most difficult issues facing transgender children, teenagers and adults. Today, we're going to talk to a man who has detransitioned. Richard Hoskins, who's an author and criminologist, identified for 4 years as Rachel, undergoing hormone treatment on the NHS and multiple operations abroad, which he paid for privately. He was about to complete one of the final physical changes a trans woman can choose to undergo, a vagina construction, when he changed his mind. After having therapy, he was diagnosed with complex PTSD, which was linked to abuse he'd suffered as a child and the deaths of 3 of his children. He now says more should have been done to support his mental health before rushing him, his words, towards gender reassignment. And Richard's here for his first broadcast interview. Good morning. Thank you for talking to us and to our audience. Explain to our audience why you believe you began identifying as a woman.
I, at the time, was really convinced, and I guess convincing to people that I really was in the wrong body, trapped in the wrong body. This is one of the sort of favourite phrases that's used, and I convinced myself of that I was in the wrong gender, that I should have been born female, and that the only way to be happy was to go through the process and actually become Rachel, as I called myself. So I genuinely believed it.
And your family around you, friends?
Found it hard, very hard. Children particularly, I think, struggle with this. That is children of people transitioning. My mother obviously struggled with it a bit, but I had also a huge amount of support from people. So I think in this culture, people are sort of encouraged to be as affirming as possible of people who transition or feel that they need to transition.
And this was in 2014, 6 years ago. You were 49 then.
Yeah.
And you bought some hormones illegally online, didn't you?
I did.
What effect did they have on you?
Massive physical changes and emotional changes. They're powerful things. Hormones are really, really strong. And there's 2 sort of strands to what you take. One is to block, in my case, testosterone, so block what's known as the androgen receptors. And the other is actually the opposite, is to positively take estrogen. So I did both, and I bought them off. I sourced the internet, I went onto forums, found out where you can get hold of these things, and I took, illegally as you say, some pretty powerful anti-androgens, some pretty powerful testosterone blockers, as well as taking estrogen. And they left me not only with big physical changes, some which are irreversible, but...
i.e. breasts, for example.
Breast
you
growth.
went up to, what, 36, 38C?
Yeah, 38C. The only way now that I could change that is to have surgery. So big changes and big hormone swings as well, emotional swings. I changed hugely. There's some things you can't change. As a man transitioning, you can't remove your stubble that way. I had 80 hours worth of electrolysis to do that. But my face did change, and I looked very different. I became, at times, moderately convincing as a female.
And all this was on the NHS. It was some 80 hours of electrolysis, for example, on the NHS.
And voice training on the NHS, yeah.
So you you bought the hormones illegally online.
Yeah.
Then you went to your GP.
Yeah, because I was feeling unwell. Yeah.
And that's when you were on the path in the NHS.
I was, and I was pretty much hurtled through. Really, I went to the GP who felt sorry for me. So fair play to her. She referred me to the GIC, Gender Identity Clinic, and normally that takes best part of a year of the waiting list. I mean, there'll be people watching the show, I'm sure, who are desperately wanting to transition. Who
waited much longer than that.
Yeah. I saw my first consultant in 2 weeks, which is incredible, really.
Very unusual.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
I guess I got a couple of theories. One is that they knew I was self-prescribing and that I needed help. Maybe. I mean, that's to put a good side on it. But it could also be that I'm highly educated, I'd done my research and was very convincing. And, you know, that's a slightly disturbing truth, if it is a truth. You know, if it is that, then there's lots of people who, you know, maybe can't sound as convincing. I did sound convincing.
But the way you describe it like that, it's as though you were trying to trick them into believing that you wanted to transition.
Well, I know now what was going on. At the time, I certainly didn't think I was tricking. I really was convinced the only way for me to live and be happy was to be Rachel.
Right. You then underwent a number of complex and painful operations abroad in Thailand, which you paid for privately.
Yeah.
Tell our audience about that.
Well, the first one is a pretty graphic one, and I haven't put this in print anywhere because it's obviously very personal. and it was painful too in lots of ways. I had what's known as an orchidectomy, which is the removal of testicles. And in a way, I think it is important to say that because, you know, this was me genuinely feeling the only way to live was to go through with this. And it's about the most drastic thing in some ways that a guy can do. It's you know, it was shocking. At the time, I woke from the operation and the first word I shouted out was, yes. So I really did believe that this is what I needed to do to be me. And so I had my testicles removed. And that has caused me no end of trouble. I mean, I have no naturally occurring hormones now in my body. So it's a drastic thing to do, really drastic. I mean, actually, I've since had artificial ones put in, but, you know, I think apparently look convincing. But, you know, that doesn't replace the actual hormones. And for a man, there's no other form of hormone production in the body.
You also had in Thailand a very painful and over many hours facial reconstruction, effectively. Just describe that for us.
I did. I had a 9-hour operation, which was brutal, just because of the nature of the operation. So not just full facelift and neck lift and liposuction and such like, but actual reconstruction. So they ground down my forehead, so changed the shape of my forehead, gave me a nose job as well, and sort of made my face and skull actually slightly smaller as well. It was a gruesome, very tough operation, and I was in a pretty bad way afterwards for quite a long time. I still can't feel my skull in places, and I still have real problems with my sinuses and such like.
When you came back to Britain, in March 2017, you had a letter from the NHS. It was saying what?
That letter offered me full vaginoplasty, which is the construction of a vagina out of the penis. So that is the full works of trying to change your genitals into female genitals. And that landed on my doormat. And it was a very fast process. I was due to go to Nuffield Hospital in Brighton under the NHS for that consultation, 2 months with a view to having the operation in a couple of months' time.
Right. When you received that letter, what did it make you do?
It was the moment, I suppose, of absolute doubt. I was beginning, from 4 weeks earlier, I'd started to question.
Because you'd been to see a...
I went to see a psychotherapist, a gender psychotherapist, as it happens, and not really about that purpose, but she was extraordinary. She said to me, and it was one of those life jaw-dropping moments, she said to me, Rachel, I want to know what's going on underneath there. What pain are you carrying? And it was the first time in this whole process that had lasted, at this point, 3 years, first time anybody had stopped and said, what actually is going on underneath the surface here? You're carrying pain. And she was right.
But when you're on the path towards transitioning, which you can get off at any point, of course, you do receive counselling.
You do, but it's
on the NHS.
You do, but it's gender counselling, and it's only 3 appointments.
Meaning what?
Well, they are psychiatrists who see you, but they are gender consultants, and they, frankly, only really are focused on the gender issue. It's just one of the problems with the setup. They obviously do ask your backstory, so I did tell them about my traumatic past, but they didn't really address that. Well, they didn't address it at all. They were talking about and wanted to look at the gender issue. Do you genuinely have what they call gender dysphoria, the idea that you're living in the wrong body? And they said yes, and that's all they wanted to talk about and focus on.
And if they'd asked you that question, you would have said,
well,
yes?
I've had 2.5 years of really intensive post-traumatic stress counselling, so I probably wouldn't straight away have said. But I do think that any therapist worth his or her salt really should be sufficiently skilled to detect, as my therapist later did, look, there's something else going on here we need to explore. And I mean, this is one of the things I would say. I'm not against gender transition at all. If some people genuinely feel it's the only way to live and they do genuinely feel they're born in the wrong body, fantastic, go for it.
And you will have met those people.
Absolutely, and let's give them all the support. But what I would say equally is that there are a huge number of people, I think, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, who do use, like me, gender transition as a form of escape. And this is what I came to realise. I was escaping my pain. I was disassociating from my own identity. And it's totally understandable. It's a flight reaction. It's a totally understandable reaction. I had gone through extreme trauma, multiple trauma, and I didn't realise it at the time. That's what PTSD does to you. It switches off the normal ways in which you can analyse things. And I didn't realise it. That is what I was doing. I was escaping my identity, living as somebody else, because I couldn't deal with the pain inside me. And it is really tough to deal with that pain.
The Nottinghamshire Healthcare Trust say we can't comment on individual cases due to patient confidentiality. However, we follow national and international guidance, and all patients undergo a comprehensive assessment to establish eligibility for physical interventions and to ensure that they are fully aware of the complexities surrounding medical transition. Fair enough?
Yeah, fair enough. What it doesn't address, though, is that underneath, in my case, was trauma. Now, I recognise that not everyone's got the kind of complex trauma that I'd gone through, but a lot of people who I think present with gender transition do have other issues going on. And all I'm saying is, let's pause the process, let's slow it down, and let's at least make sure, let's deal with that first, because I know a lot of people on trans forums, and I've got a lot of trans friends who actually now regret. And we have to be honest about this, and they do regret.
Slow it down to what? Because I mean,
Well,
I've got all the details here of what the guidelines are. If we're talking about genital reconstructive surgery, you need to live in your preferred gender identity full time for at least a year. This is known as social gender role transition. And so, I mean, I've got them all here.
But none of that's talking about trauma, you see. This is the thing.
But when you say slow it down, what are you talking about?
I should have had weekly therapy.
Weekly therapy?
Absolutely. That's what I've had to fund privately. I mean, I now know that I had complex post-traumatic stress. It's not surprising. Deaths of 3 children and sexual abuse as a child. I didn't realise at the time, but it's not surprising. I was, in deep, deep pain. Yeah. And that took a lot of counselling to get through. It's a very exacting process. It requires an awful lot of effort, and it hasn't been easy to pull out that trauma and let it go into the past and live back as me, as Richard. It's a tough process, and I think for anybody, looking to, it is a hard one, but I do think a lot of people are using gender transition to escape their own identity for reasons that are not
because
just
it's happened to you. Have you met other people who say that?
Lots of other people.
Let me read these messages. Ryan has emailed to say, I'm a 35-year-old transgender man. I've known who I was since childhood. When I finally made the decision to transition, it took me 2 years to see a specialist and another 8 months for the first medical intervention. Hormones. These waits are now twice as long due to the underfunding of gender clinics. While I have full support for anyone deciding to detransition, it is crucial to note that those patients amount for only 1% of trans people registered with the NHS. A predominant majority, 99% of us, decide to move on with our lives once we complete our transition and are much happier than ever before.
Well, great for Ryan, but I have to say that if you look on the trans forums, and I've been a prominent member of one of the most biggest ones in the world, a lot of people do regret, not just the physical pain is often acute, physical symptoms are often acute, but also the emotional trauma of going through it. It's a very tough process. But I mean, the point...
Do you think I mean, I don't know, because I haven't been on a trans forum. Those on a trans forum are those who are unhappy, because if you're happy with the outcome, there's no need to go on a forum.
The one I visit, which I'm probably not allowed to name, is one which actually offers so much advice. It's the most prominent one in the world, and it offers, so people go on it for all kinds of advice, new techniques, surgery. But the point I really want to stress is that, is the one I made earlier. I'm not against people obviously transitioning, but first, the trauma therapy or counselling at any rate is really important, because there may be other issues. And I certainly think in the case of children, in this media-driven social image age, children presenting, saying they want to be a different identity, we have got to explore underneath if there's something else going on here. It may be to do with body image and so on and so forth. For the sake of, the nation's sanity and their sanity, I really think we first need to explore. And that's the point I want to make. First explore. Is there something else going on? Do we need to offer them full, extensive therapy first, and then support them in the process of transitioning if it's right for them?
Bill tweets this: Richard's very brave, coming on to discuss his transition and back again. It illustrates why, especially for children, nothing permanent is done without full mental health screening. Enderwee on Twitter says, you are a brave fella. I found this as well on the NHS website. After surgery, most trans women and men are happy with their new sex and feel comfortable with their gender identity. One review of a number of studies that were carried out over a 20-year period found that 96% of people who had genital reconstructive surgery were satisfied.
I mean, there are the new surveys coming out that do dispute that. The highest rate of suicide of any mental health issue is those believing they have gender dysphoria, 35%. That's the highest. That in itself alone should make us say, look, OK, is it the gender dysphoria or are there other issues? Let's just get them out of the way first.
Do you regret what you did to your body?
Yeah, absolutely. Every day. It's tough. I have to take corrective hormones now, testosterone. My hormones fluctuate wildly. I've got irreversible body change. But you know what? I'm actually lucky to be alive, and I'm actually glad and grateful to be alive. I've seen all manner of hellish trauma in my life. So actually, I do believe it's possible to overcome the past, and I do believe it's possible to live in the present. A fantastic book, Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. Brilliant book about how to live in the present that I thoroughly recommend. And I've begun to live that, begun to live in the present. And I do believe it is possible to live in your, in your own skin and be happy again, even if you've had trauma.
Do you want to, I mean, for example, you talked about the fact that you now have breasts. Do you want surgery to reduce those?
I do. I can't go outside. It might not be obvious in the studio, but I can't go outside in a t-shirt. I completed it.
Will you want that on the NHS?
I can very well understand if viewers would be really angry if I say yes, because I've done a lot of this to myself. But all I would say is I needed help. I needed support, a lot of support. I've been through hell. So if the NHS offer it, should I say no, I want to fund it privately when I don't have the funds? I would love the NHS to offer it. I think they might. But I can totally understand if people get cross about that.
Thank you very much for your candour.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you for coming on the programme. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
And if you've been affected by any of the things that Richard and I have just talked about, there are lots of organisations who can help you. Just go to the BBC's Action Line website, bbc.co.uk/Action Line.